the afternoon of January 17, 1856, a group of riders crossed on the Rio Grande into Texas near Paso del Águila, or as the Americans called it, Eagle Pass. Although the U.S.-Mexican War had made the Rio Grande an international boundary, the men crossed it as they would any river, at a place that seemed convenient and without informing authorities. Still, crossing the river was not as easy as it had been before the war. Upon learning of their crossing, the U.S. Deputy Customs Collector for Eagle Pass ordered 2 agents to pursue the riders. When the agents returned with the men, the Deputy Collector discovered the crossers had failed to declare 9 Spanish horses, 8 saddles, 8 blankets, 7 bridles, and 2 ropes. The Deputy Collector promptly seized the goods because they had been smuggled into the United States. The establishment of the Rio Grande as an international boundary at the end of the U.S.-Mexican War made many aspects of everyday trade illicit by placing international regulations and tariffs on local commerce. Rather than accept these seemingly arbitrary restrictions, border people sought to continue carrying goods freely across the Rio Grande. State agents' taxation and seizure of borderlanders' property, especially their personal belongings, interfered with common practices and created resentment. As this chapter shows, border people responded to state-imposed trade restrictions by creating their own values about what was and what was not illicit trade within a moral economy of smuggling. Illicit trade's increasing profits spurred sophisticated criminal networks, whose members crossed the line between merchants and mafiosos. On June 12, 1922, over 2 years after word reached Mexico City of an association of contrabandistas operating in Reynosa, Francisco Pérez, the Mexican consul in Hidalgo, informed superiors that smugglers evaded consular duties on more than 100,000 worth of merchandise. A year later, in a report on illicit trade along the border, Pérez recommended the employment of secret agents to monitor the vast amount of smuggling taking place there. The government needed secret agents because local witnesses did not step forward for fear of retribution. As an example, Pérez cited a group of traffickers apprehended on October 20th, 1921, who attempted to defraud the government of over $250,000 worth of revenue, and who after a time were set free, had their merchandise returned, and now threatened the same authorities who apprehended them. Mexican traffickers' willingness to intimidate and corrupt law enforcement illustrates their growing power beyond the customary moral economy of smuggling. State failures against organized smugglers, in turn, bred apathy among local authorities, who unsurprisingly proved uncooperative in federal investigations. And that is from Border Contraband, A History of Smuggling Across the Rio Grande by George T. Díaz. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Hard Country Podcast. My name is Melissa Ford. I'm a policy director at the Texas Public Policy Foundation, and I am joined by Josh Treviño, the Foundation's Chief of Intelligence and Research.
Hello, Melissa.
Yeah, Josh, thanks for being here. It's good to have you back.
Thank you. I love the passage that you read.
Thank you. The reason that I chose it is because the author in this book, he looks at, what smuggling has looked like at different times, right? And so he starts by talking about how smuggling looked like after the imposition of the legal border and tariffs back then. And then he kind of jumps to after the 1910 Mexican Revolution, where smuggling looked a little bit different, right? There was all this contrabando, so, drugs, guns, alcohol after Prohibition as well.
Sure.
And then, he also talks about how a lot of the local residents and even the politicians and the smugglers tolerated a certain degree of smuggling. And a lot of people looked the other way because they saw it as their right.
Right.
In a sense.
Right.
And then at the end of the book, the author also goes into what that looked like after World War II. There was, a lot more surveillance placed at that point. But with more surveillance come new sophisticated ways to evolve in smuggling.
Yeah.
So I thought that was interesting. We've talked about this a lot in our podcast, how a lot of history repeats itself. And so reading about how this has been an issue for so long and seeing the issue now at the border, I thought would be a good way to segue into what you did this week, which is you were just at the border yourself.
I was.
So I made it a point not to ask you a lot about this earlier today because I wanted you to fill me in along with our listeners on what that was like.
I'd be happy to. I and some colleagues and some organizational allies of ours did spend 3 days at the border. We essentially started in McAllen in the Rio Grande Valley and then traveled upriver, ending in Laredo. And actually, we currently have a colleague right now, the estimable Corinne Martinez, who is on her way to Paso de Aguila, Eagle Pass.
Paso de Aguila.
It was interesting. I did not know. Of course, the Mexican town across the river from Eagle Pass is Piedras Negras,
right,
which is the birthplace of the nacho. Very
That's
important.
right,
Very
yeah.
important for world civilization and culture to know that the birthplace of the nacho is there. They have an annual Nacho Fest.
That's amazing.
I think it's in October. Someday I want to go to it. But I didn't realize that Eagle Pass was taken from Paso de Aguila. In fact, I don't even know. You tell me, what's a piedras? ¿Qué significa piedras?
Rock.
It's rock. Oh, it's black rock.
Yeah, black rock.
Interesting. So I guess Paso de Aguila has disappeared into history.
Guess so.
The passage is interesting, because it talks about this desire to initially to trade within the region, right? And I think it's worth illuminating. The whole border is not the same, so it's not a unity even within Texas. There's different qualities to different sections of the border.
Right.
The section of the border that Paso de Aguila, that Eagle Pass belongs to, is more or less continuous with. It's not Nueva Santander, but it's close enough for our purposes. This sort of unity of culture and settlement that was established in the 1750s under Escandon, which was the Spanish kind of the final act of Spanish conquest, and so when a formal international border is established in 1848. There's a real sense that the Rio Grande was not supposed to be the terminus of a region, but the centerpiece of it. And so, of course, you trade over it, and that ends up becoming sort of the origin of local smuggler culture, right? Because what one might see as smuggling from kind of an officious bureaucratic standpoint, if you're defending a state border, is really just trading, literally, in some cases, literally with your relatives who are on the other side of the river in places that you always expected to be able to reach. And so I think I think anybody can understand and empathize with that, and that continued on. 15 years later, of course, that smuggling, what quickly became a smuggling tradition, was instrumental in making the region a hotbed for the transit of Confederate cotton. Cotton going south, guns going north to at least the Texas theater of the Civil War. A lot of South Texans participated in that. One of the things I did yesterday was visit the main Catholic cemetery. In Laredo, I've got several ancestors buried there, but so I went to visit them. But I also saw the graves of the three Benavides brothers, Refugio, Santos, and Cristobal. All three of whom were major Confederate officers in Laredo. Santos Benavides led the defense of Laredo against the Union attack in 1864. Very little known episode in the Civil War, but what's fascinating about it is that these were Tejanos. These were men who were born, in some cases, under Spanish rule, but definitely identified as Mexican. They found themselves in Texas after 1848, and then when the Confederate period comes along. In Texas, they rise as officers and really local heroes. And what I thought was especially interesting about their graves, we should find a way to put the pictures up. Is that
we could put it in.
They have. They've got a pretty standard grave marker, which you'll find at the Texas State Cemetery or any number of veteran cemeteries across the country, and it's got unit of service. And in this case, the unit of service is typically CSA because they weren't in the Union Army, they were in the United States Army, they were in the Confederate Army. But somebody has gone and decorated the graves. Typically what you'll see for Confederate graves across the country is that somebody will put like a stars and bars on there, things like that. In Laredo, they put U.S. flags on these Confederate graves, which is very interesting. And it's because there's a qualitatively different experience to that period of history in South Texas with the Tejano population to the rest of the country. And so there's no contradiction to having that decoration on the grave of men who were, frankly, Confederate era heroes of South Texas. All that to say, we did see the borderland, not the first time for me by a long stretch, but I love I love this itinerary. Anybody who goes to South Texas, so for any of you out there listening or watching or thinking, you really want to spend some time in the absolute hottest part of the country you can find, definitely go down south and start in McAllen and drive upriver. You tell me where you want to start with it. I think maybe the right place to start is actually where we started our day on Tuesday morning, which was getting on a boat near the Ensalduas Park in Hidalgo County, Texas. And going on the river and traveling upriver and seeing the difference between the U.S. and Mexican side. Do you mind if I talk a little bit about that?
No, I would love to hear about that.
Just to describe it. It was a new experience for me, and I'm relatively experienced with the border. But one thing I'd never done is actually get on a boat and travel up and down the river. And what you see there on the Mexican side is actually quite distressing in a lot of ways. We were only on the river for an hour, so I can't even say that we saw a lot, compared to some folks who were able to, spend several hours or even like a work day patrolling the river. But what we saw was, first of all, a river completely devoid of illicit commerce, except for the actual bridges. So there's no fishermen, boats. You can see piers from place to place, but nobody boats on the river anymore, which is telling in itself. On the Mexican side, it is obvious that the entire south bank of the Rio Grande is under cartel control in some fashion, and it's especially stark here, which is the greater the nearest big city is Reynosa, but so there's kind of this conurbation that stretches from Brownsville, Matamoros, all the way up to basically McAllen, Reynosa, and then it kind of and then there's paired cities all the way up the rest of the river, Piedras Negras and Eagle Pass being one example. And on the Mexican side, it's almost a dystopian kind of a hellish tableau, as you see. We encountered multiple individuals who were likely cartel lookouts, some of them in uniform, and we waved to them,
like you saw them on the other side.
Saw them in the bank, and they were watching. There was one group in particular that would show up at one section of the bank, note where we were traveling. They would get in trucks, and then we would see them again about 15 minutes later downriver, upriver in this particular case. But they would. It was clear that they were kind of tracking our progress. And so as part of that, because the lookout system is they call them the Halcons, the Falcons.
Halcones,
The Halcones, because they watch. It's so robust that when we passed by places that were known to be stash houses, for example, they were deserted, and it's not because nobody was there. Like in one case, you could hear the dogs barking. These were mean dogs too, so you didn't want to go up there. But they cleared out. They didn't want to be seen. The people who didn't mind being seen, and this was very heartbreaking, were the migrants trapped on the south side. We saw a lot of individuals who were, clearly either from Haiti or Africa, and living in trash-strewn landscapes. If you can imagine a kind of a cascade, a mountain of trash cascading down this very steep bank that's maybe 20 to 30 feet upriver. And at the bottom of it, you've got herds of pigs that are rooting through the trash, and then you have people, small children, kind of picking their way through, getting down to the riverbank to wash in this filthy water, to collect water, to take back up the bank.
It's heartbreaking.
It's absolutely heartbreaking. And the thing to understand, I was talking with one of our colleagues who was there on the boat, is you have to see something like that and understand two big things. One is that the individuals who are living in these conditions are effectively prisoners. They can see the United States. They're right there. The river is not too deep, honestly, 2 to 3 feet deep in a lot of cases. So it is possible to wade the river, float across it with reasonable safety. And the reason that they don't is, of course, because they'll be killed if they do so without cartel permission. They also can't turn around and leave very easily. So these are individuals who are trapped in truly horrific conditions. The other thing to understand is that there is a decision by the individuals who should be the stewards of Mexican civil society. I'm painting with a broad brush, but if you want to narrow it a little bit, think about the city fathers of Reynosa.
Right.
If Reynosa has city fathers at this point, worthy of the name, but if you had something like this in the United States, presumably, I'll exclude places like Portland and San Francisco, but if it's not a blue-run city that's kind of going the way that those places are going, there's no civic organization to come in and say, hey, we got to clean this up. We shouldn't have herds of swine rooting through trash piles in which people are actually living, children are actually living. People are trying to scrape out an existence there with all the refuse and the sewage and the just in terms of plain humanity to these individuals. And so it absolutely breaks your heart. I'll close with one image that really stuck with me on the river, and then we can talk. By the way, this is just the morning. Like, we saw more as we went.
Oh, yeah.
But there was a zoo. Every establishment along the bank was deserted. So restaurants, homes, water facilities, and so on. And weirdly enough, there was a zoo. It was like
so
it was like something out of Blade Runner. So the zoo had been taken over by the cartel many years ago. They said it was Cartel de Golfo at this point.
Yeah.
Who knows if it's true? I'm not going to go ask. But the zoo's taken over, and long ago the animal cages had been opened, and people who like tigers took the tigers, and a lot of the animals just died. But you go and it's an abandoned zoo. And so we're taking the boat by it, and there's some horses, which is actually not unusual to see out there. And then strolling toward the riverbank, serene and absolutely out of place, was a llama.
What the heck?
A llama, high altitude South American animal, and there was a llama there, and apparently the llama. And I asked the guy who was showing us around. I said, "Is that a zoo animal?" And he said, "Yeah." I says, "This llama's a survivor. Should have died long ago. This is not where he's supposed to be. He's not, he's not built. He's covered in wool, right? And so it's
what
hot.
Is it, like over 100 degrees?
Oh, it was about 106, and
my
extremely high humidity. And you would think that the llama would have kicked off, but this llama, for whatever reason, maybe he's maybe the llama is the bearer of the spirit of renewal. Who knows? But he lived, and he was going down to the river for a drink, and apparently he'd just been there loitering in the zoo for years.
Wow.
Man, yeah, it's
so random.
Very, very, very much so, but so indicative of the chaos that these cartels and their abettors in the state among a Mexican population that candidly does not deserve this fate.
Right. And I'd love you to continue, weaving in some of the things that you saw at the border. But I wanted to ask you about something. I don't know if you've seen it. It just came out yesterday. But this article that I was reading on the Houston Chronicle, which talks about how, since we're on the topic of migrants, how Texas troopers are now being ordered to separate families at the border. I know this is an old thing. Like, it's come up before that, families are being separated at the border. But it's interesting to me because it does signify a new policy shift. Since Governor Abbott started with his border security efforts, back then they were told not to separate families, period. Unless the children traveling with the family were over 18, then you could take the father of the family and you can arrest him for trespassing, or you could take him into custody, right?
Right.
But apparently over 24 families recently have been separated in the sense that the father has been arrested immediately as soon as he crossed the border, and then the families, as the mothers and the children, are being kept together. And so this is a new policy. A DPS spokesperson came out and talked about it, saying, yes, this is happening, but the mother and children are being kept together. And so I just wanted, have you heard about this?
No, I'm afraid I haven't. I'm caught off guard. I mean, I'm aware that it was happening because I saw a headline, but I didn't read it. Do you know what the rationale they gave for the policy was? What did DPS talk about that?
No, not a lot. It's very new.
Yeah, it's like the last 24 hours, right?
Yeah, so we need to keep looking into it. But I just thought it was interesting that there's being these, policy shifts recently. I'm
not going to try and read the policymakers' minds because I genuinely don't know. So for the sake of those watching on later days, I don't know why the policy's been implemented right now. But I can, if I had to guess, I know that there have been real issues with what I'll call false heads of family coming in, typically with children. I don't know about with women and children and things like that. But we had a conversation yesterday in Laredo, and I don't have permission to put this gentleman on the record, but he's somebody who's very familiar with kind of what's happening with human trafficking, particularly in the Laredo sector. And he told us, this is not a surprise, unfortunately, because we've heard it before, but he told us that there is a market for children. And there's no other way to put it. As cruel and horrific as that sounds, people will either in these places of origination, whether it's in Mexico or Guatemala or Honduras or anywhere else, they will either sell their children to traffickers, or the children will simply be kidnapped by gangs and passed along. So if you can imagine being like a 3-year-old, playing in the yard, and somebody comes and takes you, and the parent will never see their child again. And so I personally can't imagine a worse heartbreak than that.
Yeah.
But the reason it happens is because there's a theory that if you come with a family, if you come with children, then the United States is going to be more likely to admit you effectively, that you have a much stronger claim to whatever it is, but whatever basis you're going to claim for asylum. And that may or may not be true. Set that aside. But that is the perceived incentive that creates the market for children in this. So if I had to guess, this is just top of mind, why would they be separating, putative heads of households? It might be to remove that incentive. I don't know. Right. I don't know the answer to that.
We'll have to see how it plays out. But
if I may add just one thing on that, though, because we have to be very clear-eyed about what's happening. The gentleman with whom we were speaking on the radio yesterday told me that, or told us rather, that to find these individuals with kids, and there's no way to know, are the kids yours? And sometimes he said you could tell because the child obviously clearly does not know the adult with whom they're traveling. But other times you just don't know. Like a 2-year-old is not a font of confirmable information. They caught one guy. This is anecdote, but they caught one guy who had 7 children with him. I believe they caught him in Jim Hog.
Just one guy with 7
One
kids?
man with 7 kids in Jim Hog County. And it turned out he was a sex offender.
Oh my God.
From Mexico. He was a pedophile, and he had 7 children. And God knows what happened to those kids. But this is an individual. Now, he was from south of the border. He's not an American citizen. But he was able essentially to obtain 7 children, get to the United States, and then have them essentially undetected for a long while. The coda to the tragedy of all this is that these kids are trafficked here, and one best case scenario, they're actually with their real family, and the real family who loves them and cares for them, and they take them to wherever they're going. But more common in many ways, in worst case, is that the kids are they're either abandoned. As soon as they reach the destination, okay, we're across the river, I'm in the United States, see you later, kid. And the child often dies in that case, especially if they're abandoned in the wild out there. Or if that doesn't happen, then the kid is put into the foster system, which is a whole different kind of chamber of horrors for these kids. I'm sorry, I said that was the last thing. Can I say one more thing?
Yes.
I apologize for this. It keeps coming back. It's just so awful. One of the DPS gentlemen with whom we spoke, and by the way, I think it's obvious for anybody who goes to the border that DPS is doing the absolute best they can in extremely difficult scenarios. So I personally, especially after seeing what we saw and speaking with whom we spoke this week, I don't buy into a lot of the kind of the anti-Texas DPS narrative that's been promulgated in a lot of press. But we can talk about that in a moment. One of the troopers told us about seeing another scenario like this, where it was a handful of adults with many more kids, small kids, and they were crossing, and there was basically a sandbar in the Rio Grande, which is pretty common. You can get there's sandbars that are inches below the surface. And there was a child who was not quite a toddler, but pretty close, maybe 18 months old, who was kind of plopped on the sandbar and sitting there in the middle of the river. And the group organized itself, collected itself on the sandbar, and then they moved off. And every person grabbed a couple of kids and moved off, and they left the small child there, just there on the sandbar. They just left him there. They didn't care. And this trooper said that they're on the Texas bank. They can see him crossing, and at first they're observing. Then they realize they're just going to abandon the kid in the river. The kid will die. The child will drown. And they start yelling, "Get the baby! Get the baby! Get the baby! You got to get the baby! Get the baby!" And they have to go and they have to confront. They say, "Get back out there and get the kid. Get him." These are not people who are related to these children. These are not people who care if these kids live or die. And so, thank God, in this case, they did get somebody to turn around, re-enter the river, grab the child that they left in the river, and bring him to the Texas side. But when we talk about the things that we talk about and say that the most humane thing we can do is shut down this commerce, shut down this traffic, close this border, that's the kind of thing that we're talking about, because this is the outcome. And, what starts as, the passage that you read at the beginning, very sympathetic tales of people in Guerrero Viejo and Revilla and Mier who just want to sell their wares in Roma across the river.
It's not what it used to be.
I get that, yeah. But that's not what's happening today.
Right.
That was happening in 1848. It's not happening in 2023.
Yeah.
Anyway, thank you for coming to my TED Talk, Melissa. Yes, go ahead.
You've really managed to depress us all beyond repair. But since we're on depressing topics...
It's not the first time, so go ahead.
Yeah. Well, you were saying how there's this narrative a lot of the time, right? This is not what the migrants come here for. Mm-mm. And even in the Houston Chronicle article that I was reading, at the end, they interview one of the women that crossed and were separated from what she says is like the father of her children, right? Mm-hmm. And she talks about how she's up north somewhere now with her 2 children. They're both sick. They're struggling. They don't have any money. And it just kind of made me reflect on how this is not what they came here for, right? Like a lot of the time they're told, come here, the borders are open, you'll get a job. And then that's what drives them right into the grasp of the cartels, right?
Right.
They're being exploited. Their money is taken away from them. They're often being abused. And so it's just very sad to think about. And I think it's very important for us to make sure that this hits home, that the most inhumane thing that you could do is allow the suffering to continue on the course that it's on.
Absolutely.
And so on that topic, I wanted to ask you about the buoy situation, just a couple of hours down the river.
Yes. Do you want to give a background for our listeners on that?
Yes. So for our listeners, that we talked about this a little bit last week, mm-hmm. about these big orange buoys that I think it's 1,000 meters, maybe a stretch of about 1,000 meters on the Rio Grande, to prevent or to dissuade migrants from crossing the river to begin with. Yeah. And so a lot of people are saying, they're inhumane, like we shouldn't be doing this. To which we ask, like, what's the alternative? To remove them and to, give the control of the border back to the cartels who are going to do worse things. Before the buoys were put in place, the U.S.-Mexico border was already the most dangerous land crossing in the world.
Right.
People were already drowning. Like you said, the story with the kid, people were already being left in the heat, mm-hmm. and no one cared to say anything. But now with the buoys, people are speaking up that have not spoken up about it before. And one of the groups that spoke up is the Mexican government. Just today, they released 2 statements. I don't know if this was like maybe 2 hours ago.
I've seen both the statements, yeah.
This is very recent, but the foreign ministry, the Secretaría de Relaciones Exteriores, first put out a statement about a dead body that was found by the buoys.
Entangled in the buoys.
Entangled in the buoys
yes.
this morning. And so they were expressing concern about this body, and they used that to point their finger towards the buoys, saying that they're inhumane. They're a violation of their sovereignty, mm-hmm. and they're a violation of the human rights of the migrants.
Right.
And then shortly after, they put out a second statement of another body that was found, not even by the buoys, but down, I think 5 kilometers away in a different part of the river that had succumbed to the heat. Yeah. And so I think what was really fascinating to me about this is that they've never issued a statement like this before. They've never showed concern for the things that the migrants go through before.
No.
And so I just wanted to get your thoughts on that. It's interesting timing, don't you think?
Yeah, I mean, look, the Mexican state has led by the president of Mexico, President López Obrador, the man of the people himself, has been extremely vocal in its disapproval of the state of Texas putting this buoy system outside of Eagle Pass and shutting down trafficking. You have to understand it in 2 ways, because they object to it on 2 grounds. One reason they object to it is simply because it's good politics for them to attack Texas. There is this sort of this base Mexican nationalistic impulse to pick a fight with Texas, and they understand correctly that if they fight with Texas, they can probably get the Biden administration on their side. Make no mistake, the Biden administration's Department of Justice and the Mexicans are cooperating on the case against Texas. It has been brought to bear on the courts. There's zero question about it. It's the same messaging, same grounds, putative treaty violations, and so on, all of which is incredibly spurious. So that's one reason they're doing it. The other reason they're doing it, though, and we have to be very clear-eyed about this, is that shutting down human trafficking, shutting down trafficking in general, whether it's human or narcotics or anything else, cuts into the profit margins of the same people who are in league with the Mexican state itself.
Right. Who does that hurt?
Who does that hurt? Right, exactly. And so when we think about who many of the major traffickers are, INM, Sedena, which is the army, local power holders, give the president of Mexico credit for understanding his own patronage network. He knows he has to go to bat for them in some way. And so it's pitiable in a sense. It's another betrayal by the Mexican elite of what should be the greatness of the Mexican nation. You're absolutely right that for all the countless deaths of migrants on the U.S.-Mexico border, from exposure, from murder, from abandonment, on and on and on, the Mexican Foreign Ministry, SRE, the Secretariat, has never issued a statement on any of them. And it is because they don't care. That's an uncharitable thing to say. It happens to be an accurate thing to say. It is because they don't care. They only care now because it can be used to score a political point on the behalf of their clientele and patronage networks versus the Texans. So as it happens, we know how that body of that unfortunate child of God ended up entangled in the buoy system in Eagle Pass. This individual did not die entangled in the buoy system. The buoys are manned 24/7. There's somebody there. It would be impossible for you to become entangled in the buoys without somebody seeing you, because there's actually quite a few Texas law enforcement and National Guard present there in Eagle Pass. This individual died upriver, and I believe it was a woman. You were telling me. So her corpse.
So that's what the Mexican president said. He called her una joven.
Una joven. Okay, well
I think so.
Well then there we go.
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine. I'll take his word for it. So it was a young woman. She drowned upriver, somewhere we don't know where, but she drowned at a different crossing, and her corpse. It seems macabre to say it, but we have to be, but her corpse floated downstream and
got entangled.
And got entangled. And the other individual who was killed, or who died, apparently of exposure, we think.
I think it was the heat.
Yeah, right, exactly. Didn't have anything to do with the buoy. So I mean, this is very crass politicking and advantage seeking on the back of real human suffering, real human tragedy. By the Mexican state, and it's we should call it what it is. I want to be. We try to be dispassionate analysts here, and describe things as they are. But in this case, I'll depart from that a little bit and say it's loathsome. It's loathsome that the president of Mexico and the whole class of individuals entrusted with the stewardship and the care of the nation to which they are charged could not be moved until now to say a word about the deaths of their own. And that's a shame. That's a shame. The Texas Department of Public Safety, the Texas National Guard, has done more to save migrant lives than the entire apparatus of the Mexican state has. Ever.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's unfortunate. I wonder if they had known the details about that death and how it ended up in the buoys, if they would have even cared to begin with. Because I think the reason they put it out is because, like you said, it scores political points, and it's one more good reason to take a dig at the governor, which AMLO did this morning. He was asked by a reporter about Governor Abbott, and he said, he shouldn't act like this. It's inhumane. You don't treat anyone like that. That's not what good people do. Only by being good can we be happy. And he's saying this about Governor Abbott when he's allowed all of this injustice and all of these terrible things to happen with migrants at the border. So it's clear that's not the real issue, and he's deflecting.
No.
And another interesting thing that I thought this was interesting. This was in the statement from the Secretaría this morning, but they talked about how unfortunate what's happening at the border is right now, because they said this action does not align with the very close relationship that the governments of the United States and Mexico have maintained.
Oh, yeah.
So I don't know what I'm missing. Close relationship. They've not wanted to work with us for a very long time.
You're dead on. It's a fiction that they have an interest in promulgating, and unfortunately, a lot of the policy class in Washington D.C., especially under the Biden regime, is perfectly willing to acquiesce to it. They'll swallow the fiction whole. Oh yeah, they're our friends. Oh yeah, we have to cooperate with them. Oh yeah, it's this and that. You and I saw it in Mexico City when we talked with U.S. government personnel who for them could not imagine anything worse than the Mexicans refusing to cooperate. Well,
it's everyone.
It's everybody.
Even
yeah.
now, like everyone is like, well, shouldn't we be focused on working with Mexico? And what about the diplomatic relations?
We'd love to work with Mexico.
Yeah, we've tried.
if they would work with us, and candidly, I think this is a point worth bringing out, is that there's no state in the union that is more pro-Mexico and pro-Mexican than the state of Texas, right here in the Lone Star State. Partly because of our heritage, we have a robust Mexican, Spanish heritage, and so we have ties of sentiment and history, and we also have ties of prudence and commerce as well. And there's nobody that would want to work with Mexico more than the state of Texas. There's no question in my mind that Greg Abbott, who has, I think, labored mightily to do the right thing on the border, and we should give him full credit for that,
right.
Would love nothing more than to be able to have a purely respect and commerce-based relationship with Mexico. We have to be clear. It is the choices of the Mexican state that have led us to this impasse, and respect has got to start with them.
Yeah. Well, speaking of respect,
sure.
They don't have any. Because I think you've read about this, but we were speaking about the Biden administration.
Sure.
But AMLO once again last week blasted the DEA for something that they said. So basically, the DEA administrator Ann Milgram was testifying not this Thursday but last week.
Oh yes.
And she was talking about the Sinaloa cartel and the Jalisco Nueva Generación cartel, and she was estimating their size and their reach. So she said a couple of things.
Sure.
She said that both cartels have more than 40,000 operatives in over 100 countries around the world, that the Sinaloa cartel has presence in 19 out of the 32 Mexican states, and the Jalisco one has a presence in 21 out of the 32 Mexican states. And then she says that they have identified that they both have members, associates, facilitators, and brokers around the world and in all 50 states. And so this is, no news to us. We've known about this for a very long time. We know they have a worldwide reach.
Yes.
But when AMLO was asked about these remarks, he was at a press conference in Nayarit on Friday. He basically had 4 responses. The first one was, well, we don't have that information. I don't know where that lady got it from, is what he said. The second one was, what proof did they have? They don't have any proof. Yeah. And then the third thing that he said is, the U.S. government has a lot of problems. They're very disorganized. They don't cooperate. Their departments don't cooperate. That, we used to have that problem here in Mexico, but we got organized, and now we work together, and we don't have that problem anymore. Yeah. But the U.S. is a mess.
They got organized by eliminating bureaucratic independence.
Right.
Entirely, yeah.
And then the last thing he said is, but U.S. authorities don't have good information anyway, so we shouldn't be listening to them, essentially, right. Because, and then he recalled something from a while back, and he recalled they once claimed that 1/3 of Mexico's territory is controlled by criminal organizations.
The Landau estimate, yes.
Yeah. So it's interesting, he's denying all these claims. He's saying that the U.S. is a mess, that we don't have good information. But then when he was asked, well, like, what is the real information? Like, how many states of Mexico are these cartels actually operating in? He just completely evaded the question. And so it doesn't seem like he knows either.
You have to, he knows. So he knows.
Right.
Let's be clear.
He doesn't want to make it clear that he knows.
You have to look at the named organizations that the DEA administrator Ann Milgram, right?
Yes.
That's who's speaking. So you have to look at the named organizations that the DEA administrator was speaking of. Nueva Generación, set them aside. But the Sinaloans, we know that the president of Mexico has an special affection for. You and I have talked about this many times on this show. He's visited the Chapito's mother. He's talked about how much he respects them. He's kind of bent over backwards. We've had multiple reports from multiple sources that his party organization Morena has leveraged Sinaloan cartel muscle to win. I'll put that in quotes, but win elections in Sinaloa proper. So he's never had a bad thing to say about the Sinaloan cartel, ever. Ever. And
he's even expressed sympathy.
He's expressed sympathy. He springs to their defense. This is another datum in that roster, and in which it's clearly a trigger point for him, and he feels, for whatever reason, and the informed viewer can speculate as to what that reason is, that he needs to defend them. against what seems like a pretty anodyne estimate by the DEA administrator. And so he does. And, we should, on our side, we should observe that and learn from it and take it for what it is.
Yeah.
Which is a signal as to where he believes his real interests are.
Yeah. Well,
There's
he's
more
talking and we should listen.
Yeah,
right?
no, exactly. Rodney Scott on this webinar that we just did separate this morning said something that I think is worth repeating, so I'll steal it from Rodney. We have to create a different incentive structure for them. One thing that you and I have talked over and over about is that the United States is never going to fix Mexico. Like, that's not our job. It's not what the foundation aims to do. Our goal is not to fix Mexico. Our goal is the defense and preservation of the way of life here in Texas primarily, and then in the United States at large. That being said, we can create different incentive structures vis-a-vis ourselves with the incentives that we do have, which we've never really maximized, and we ought to, versus the Mexican state. And right now, there's no incentive for a president of Mexico or a governor or anyone else to work with or at least placate the United States versus the cartels. And so they respond to the incentives. They respond to the rational incentives. In this case, there's no penalty for doing the things that AMLO does. There's nobody in the Biden White House who's going to say, wait a minute, why are you so assiduous and avid in your defense of the Sinaloan cartels? They're not going to ask that question because they simply aren't intellectually equipped to do it. But we can push policymakers in that direction, and we are. And we can ask those questions ourselves, and we must keep asking it. Because eventually events will culminate in everybody asking it. And the question is what happens when we get to that point.
Yeah.
Right.
And, as shocking as it is to see the president of Mexico so blatantly defending the cartels, what's shocking to me is seeing that on the U.S. side. Like, seeing it on the U.S. side, what seems to me to be the Biden administration making excuses for cartels. So last week, Secretary Mayorkas was testifying, and he was asked if during his tenure, cartels have gotten stronger or weaker. And he said that during his tenure as Secretary of Homeland Security, cartels have gotten weaker. Which is, have you heard that?
No, I didn't really. He really said that? He said they've gotten weaker since he's been in office?
I'll see if I can put the timestamp here. But he was, being
amazing.
grilled, and he basically said, it's unprecedented, the actions that we've taken against cartels. He said they've gotten weaker, which is absolutely, it's beyond me. I've gotten a lot of, this is something we've talked about a lot this week. I got a question about it yesterday.
Wow.
Yeah, so...
Not even analysts on the left believe that. I mean, people who disagree with us completely on it.
But Josh, it's not out there. No one's talking about this.
Wow.
We saw it because we were watching the hearing, but when you try to look up the clip, when you try to look up articles about it, you can't find anything.
Nobody reports on it.
I had to look at the, whatever it was, like a 5-hour hearing to find the clip and send it to our comms team to find it, the clip about him saying this. And so I'm glad you haven't heard about this yet, because I want to get your real reaction. But to me, it was just honestly, first of all, embarrassing.
Sure.
Because embarrassing for them. Because there's a recent poll that shows that 61% of Americans, most Americans, that's a majority of Americans, think that cartels have more control of the southern border than the current Biden administration. And for him to be saying that under him, cartels are weaker than ever before, they're the best funded criminal organization in the entire world. And right now we can thank the Biden administration and Secretary Mayorkas for making that happen, for making them richer, bolder, stronger than ever before.
We've been very hard on the state of Mexican civics. So, in fairness, we should turn our attention to American civics for a moment because there are serious issues here too. And I think this is a great example of some of those issues. This is probably obvious. I'm considerably older than you, so I remember the Cold War quite well. And there was a phrase in the Cold War that politics stops at the water's edge. It was always more aspirational than true. It wasn't. It was a goal rather than a reality in many cases. But it was still an admirable goal. It was supposed to be the standard that whoever held the White House, whoever held the Congress, they would defend America the same. There was a common agreement on what it took to defend the United States, and it mostly worked. I stress the word mostly, but it mostly worked. That doesn't seem to hold true anymore, and you really have to ask yourself, with a federal government whose top tier officials sincerely, they say things like that. If they believe it, they're delusional. If they don't believe it, they're liars. Right. So there's not a lot of good outcomes on that. We talked with some landowners yesterday, and 2 days ago, we talked to some landowners, and these were men in some cases. Again, I don't have permission to identify them on camera, but some of them were still on ranch land from the original porciones that their ancestors had received 300 years ago from the King of Spain. So these are individuals with deep roots and real Spanish/Mexican heritage as well, and they were they're suffering grievous economic losses. Several of them have had guns pointed at them. We talked to a guy who encountered basically a squad's worth of men with rifles who he thought they were going to kill him on his own property in the state of Texas. And they asked us, what is the United States going to protect us? One of the guys who I had a great empathy for said, I served my country in the Army. I'm a very proud American. My first language is Spanish, and I'm from South Texas, but I'm 100% American, and I wore the uniform, and I expect the United States to defend my community, to defend my way of life, to do this.
As you should.
And this is sort of the larger danger of what's happening at the southern border, and it's something that Washington D.C. is completely oblivious to. If the United States is not going to uphold its end of the social contract, if it's not going to do the things that the Constitution and its preamble says it should do, provide for, secure the common defense, provide for domestic tranquility, or provide for the common defense, secure domestic tranquility. I apologize to my civics students out there. If it doesn't do those things, what good is it? What's it for? And I'm not asking that as a rhetorical lead-in to, well, we should go it alone. That's not what I'm getting at. What I'm getting at is the fact that people ask those questions. Right. Ordinary citizens who have no interest in any kind of radicalism or overturning the order are starting to ask those questions because they have been genuinely abandoned.
And they're sick of it.
They're sick of it by people like Mayorkas, who's up there in Washington, D.C. saying, oh, the cartels are clearly weaker.
Patting himself on the back.
Oh, right. I mean, absolutely. And no hope of real substantive change. That is such a dangerous situation. You might get, I'm going to stereotype my brothers and sisters from California, but they kind of deserve it. You get Californians to submit to that indefinitely. In the long run, you won't have Texans submit to it indefinitely. Yeah. You cannot threaten a way of life in the way that the way of life, especially in South Texas, in the South Texas that my family's from, indefinitely without something breaking in the long run. Not with the tradition and the history and the character that region has. And Washington, D.C. is playing with fire. To Austin's credit, to the governor's credit here in Texas, there's a recognition of that. I think they're doing as much as they can. But we're not at the end point of this saga by a long shot. And I for one, am tremendously worried for the civics of the United States, not just our region, but writ large, given what comes next in this.
Yeah, I think that's very accurate. And when you ask what good is it, we've talked about this before, right? And a lot of people that don't want to be involved in politics have had to ask themselves this question, right?
Yes.
We have, as you say, a very strong and robust military, right? And they are deployed to all sorts of things around the world. And honestly, they should be, right?
Sure.
But they're not on American soil protecting American lives in places that honestly you can drive to in a couple of hours.
That's right.
And that's insane. And yeah, I mean,
we should probably close with this pretty quickly because we're almost at the end of the hour. But just to invoke another Cold War commonality, and I don't remember who said this. It might have been a Reagan quote, but there was this assertion made during the Cold War that the beauty of the free world versus the communist bloc was that in the free world, if you wanted to, you didn't have to be political. You could ignore politics. Like you could get up and, there's people who just didn't bother to vote and things like that, or they didn't really have a political opinion. They didn't get involved. And you could do that because it was a free country and people would largely leave you alone. I mean, that was basically, you could live free and politics weren't your first concern. And in the communist world, of course, everything is political, and so you had to worry constantly about politics. Who's in power? What do they expect of me? What sign should I put in the shop window, and so on. It's a constricting way of life. What's happening at the border is unfreedom coming in by virtue of the insecurity, and it's forcing people to be political who would rather not be. In that sense, and in that sense, there's something un-American about what's being done to that region. And it's not going to stop with them. It's going to affect and is affecting the entire country. So how's that? You said I depressed you earlier in the show.
I was hoping that something...
I don't think things have improved.
No. So I think we need to wrap up before it gets worse.
Go ahead.
I wanted to, cheer us up before that, but it seems like this will just be a depressing episode. But we'll be back next week.
Yes.
So thank you, Josh. It's good to have you back.
Thanks,
you.
Melissa.
And thank you to all of our listeners. And we'll see you next time.